Hello again everybody, and more on the history of the earliest church. Yesterday I spoke about how some churches were founded and about tensions between the Jewish side of the church and the Gentile side of the church, and today I'm going to be looking as the church looked to spread its influence further. So, as we have seen, within 20 years or so of the crucifixion, Christians were to be found in far apart as Judea and Samaria, Cyrene and Cilician Antioch, Damascus and Phoenicia. So how did that come about, and what problems occurred, and what happened as a result of all of that? Well, against a background of religious exclusion, Judaism, and religious indifference, the traditional Roman model, the preaching and seeking of converts by the Christian church must have been something of a shock. With its appeal to all, both men and women, and slave and free, both Greeks, Hebrews and Latin speakers, the openness of Christianity, that idea of the brotherhood of man, was pretty unusual. It did have some similarities with the worship of Isis, both in rituals and with the promise of a better eternal life, but it lacked the possibility of the rowdy behaviour in festivals that Isis seemed to offer. Christianity challenged some local traders, such as Paul encountered in the city of Philippi. Now, there was a slave girl there who, it was said, had an oracular spirit. She could foretell the future. And Paul went along and, in a ritual of exorcism, cast out her demon. And that robbed her of the ability to predict the future, or apparently so. Her owners were pretty cross with Paul and Silas, and so they had Paul and Silas arrested. What followed then gives an insight into one little aspect of life within the Roman Empire. The local magistrates' initial reaction was to have them beaten and flogged. Now, this was a big problem for the magistrates. It was a big problem for Paul and Silas, but it was a big problem also for the magistrates, as it was illegal to flog a Roman citizen, and they could have been prosecuted for so doing. Now, this had a major outcome in a later incident, but for the moment, the local magistrate resolved this by releasing Paul and Silas with an apology. And Paul, at this point, didn't cut up rough about it. Now, there'd already, on Paul's missionary journeys, been riots in Pisidia, in Iconium, Thessalonica and Berea, all of which are in northern Greece or southern Turkey, Asia Minor. Mostly these were caused by hostility from the Jewish authorities in local synagogues, and presumably they feared that this new cult would flourish, and their response was more to be aggressive in their response than Rabbi Gamaliel had been in Jerusalem, who regarded it as just another crank coming along. So despite these beatings and floggings and the imprisonment that occasionally went with it, Paul and Silas, and then Paul and Barnabas, persisted. Now, there was an interesting detail which occurred in Lystra, also in Turkey, where the people thought that Paul and Barnabas were Mercury and Jupiter. Now, the curious detail about this is that they thought that Barnabas was more important than Paul, and they regarded him as an embodiment of Jupiter, whereas Paul was merely the messenger Mercury. On to Athens, and Paul failed. Now, Luke, in the book of Acts, does his best to make the best of it by recording a couple of conversions, two names, one male, one female. Dionysius became called Dionysius the Areopagite, and also Damaris. Interesting that he names one male and one female there rather than a number of males. But Paul's attempt to defeat the philosophers of Athens in the debate at the court of the Areopagus was laughed at, and they were laughed out of the court. And as Molly Whitaker, the classical scholar, says, he was dismissed as one of the many cranks who frequented Athens at that time. After more disturbances in Corinth, Paul received some legal protection from the local Roman governor Gallio, who was, interestingly, the brother of Seneca, about whose letters I spoke earlier. He stayed there as a result, Luke tells us, for some time, And that perhaps is why Corinth was close to Paul's heart, and he wrote the two major letters to the Corinthians. Moving on to Ephesus, there was another riotous situation where Paul caused disruption to Demetrius the silversmith. Now he and other trinket makers made trinkets and souvenirs related to the Temple of Diana, which was a massive tourist attraction. It was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. When Paul came along and said that Diana didn't exist and people were wasting their money, there was a riot. The people were rounded up and there was a bit of mob violence and a lot of shouting of greatest Diana of the Ephesians, and Paul was once again run out of town. On his return to Jerusalem, he continued to preach, including in the temple, and that upset the Jewish authorities again, fairly predictably, and there was a threatened flogging. Now, in the next little bit, something of Paul's character is revealed. So this is what happened when he was threatened with flogging. So as Luke says, Paul protested, "Can you legally flog a man who's a Roman citizen and moreover has not been found guilty?" When the centurion heard this, he went and reported it to the commandant. "What do you mean to do?" he said. This man's a Roman citizen." Commandant came to Paul. "Tell me, are you a Roman citizen?" he asked. "Yes," said he. The commandant rejoined, "Cost me a large sum to acquire my citizenship." Paul said, "Mine was mine by birth." Then those who were about to examine him withdrew hastily, and the commandant himself was alarmed when he realized that Paul was a Roman citizen and that he had put him in irons. What's a local governor to do when he finds he's made that mistake? Well, he did what anybody would do, and that is pass on the problem to somebody else. And so Paul was then moved from Jerusalem to Caesarea, which effectively was the local capital, much developed by the Romans, and he was then faced with a trial before the governor Felix. Now, interestingly, according to Luke, Felix's wife was Jewish, and there were many discussions between them. Perhaps Felix was hoping for a bribe so that Paul would offer him money and then he could release him. An interesting little sidelight on how law and order worked in the Roman Empire. Either way, it seems that Paul's arrest wasn't that onerous, really. Then there was a change of governor. Felix went home and he was replaced by Porcius Festus. New governor, new man, new policy. And he decided that he was going to ask Paul to stand trial in Jerusalem. Now Paul, as was his citizen right, didn't fancy that, and so he appealed for trial under the emperor in Rome. That ultimately led to him being shipwrecked in Malta, and if you want to know more about that, I think you go to the video on sea travel in which that gets a mention, and then Paul finished up under house arrest in Rome, as it's recorded in Acts chapter 28. So at the beginning I asked some questions. How did the spread of Christianity actually come about? Well, preaching and teaching is fundamental to it. But that couldn't have happened without a Roman sense of law and order and a legal system which allowed Paul actually to do that under challenge. What problems were there for all this? Well, annoying people was chief amongst them, and there's something about the character of Paul which, would be a little bit grit under your heel, I think. He certainly annoyed the Jewish authorities, especially the Pharisees, by challenging Jewish custom and practice, and he also annoyed economic interests. Might even have annoyed some Roman officials by just being a bit too big for his boots. What was the result of all this? Well, certainly the church continued to grow, and Paul then ended up in Rome. And Paul ending up in Rome alongside St. Peter, maybe that's the reason why the headquarters of the church came to be in Rome rather than in Jerusalem.